Picture this. You are Anna, a bright-eyed, spirited young woman of 18, standing on the manicured lawns of the state colony for epileptics and feeble-minded in Lynchburg, Virginia, in the year 1927. The spring air is warm, carrying the scent of blooming dogwood and the distant, unsettling cries from the custodial wards. You've been here for 3 long years, sent away by a family who believed the doctors when they said you were simple and a danger to yourself. Today, however, is different. The head doctor, Dr. Bell, a man whose smile never quite reaches his cold, calculating eyes, has called you to his office. He speaks of progress, of rehabilitation, of a future where you might finally leave these walls and return to the world outside. He holds a paper, a legal document, and explains that a small, simple procedure, a minor operation, is all that stands between you and your freedom. He assures you it's for your own good, for the good of society, a way to ensure you can live a normal, productive life without the burdens of this institution. But what Dr. Bell hasn't told you is that this minor operation is a salpingectomy, a surgical procedure that will permanently sever your fallopian tubes, rendering you incapable of ever bearing children. What he hasn't told you is that this paper you're about to sign, with a trembling hand and a heart full of desperate hope, is not a path to true freedom, but a legal document that surrenders your most fundamental right, the right to decide your own future, your own family, your own body. You don't know that your mother, coerced by the local eugenics board and shamed by the community, has already given her consent, believing it's the only way to secure your release. You don't know that the kind-faced nurse who leads you to the operating room has performed this minor operation hundreds of times, her hands steady, her conscience dulled by years of institutional practice. You don't know that the very Supreme Court of the United States, in a landmark decision just months ago, upheld the legality of this procedure, declaring that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. By tomorrow night, the young woman who dreamed of a husband, a small cottage, and the laughter of her own children will be gone forever. In her place will be something irrevocably altered, a body stripped of its reproductive future, a soul scarred by the state's cold scientific theft. This was the fate of tens of thousands of Americans, deemed unfit by a pseudoscience that promised a better society but delivered systematic violation disguised as public health. Tonight, we follow Anna's descent into this medicalized hell, a journey that reveals how scientific authority, legal sanction, and societal prejudice can combine to become the most dangerous predators of all, stealing not just bodies, but futures. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. The early 20th century in America, often celebrated as an era of progress, innovation, and social reform, harbored a chilling secret: a widespread state-sanctioned program of forced sterilization. This was not a hidden scandal or an isolated act of cruelty, but a public policy rooted in the pseudo-scientific movement of eugenics that systematically targeted and violated the bodily autonomy of tens of thousands of its own citizens. This analysis delves into the grim reality of America's forced sterilization programs, focusing on the experiences of those deemed unfit to reproduce. From the turn of the 20th century through the late 1970s, and in some cases even into the 1980s, over 30 states enacted eugenic sterilization laws. These laws permitted, and often mandated, the sterilization of individuals institutionalized in state mental hospitals, prisons, and homes for the feeble-minded. With its stark contrast between the promise of scientific advancement and the brutal reality of human rights violations, fits perfectly within this framework. The eugenics movement, which provided the intellectual and moral justification for these programs, was a global phenomenon, but it found particularly fertile ground in the United States. Proponents believed that society could be improved by controlling human reproduction, encouraging the fit to have more children, and preventing the unfit from reproducing. This ideology, cloaked in the language of science and public health, led to the targeting of specific populations: the poor, the disabled, racial minorities, immigrants, and those deemed morally delinquent. Between 1907, when Indiana passed the first eugenic sterilization law, and the 1980s, An estimated 60,000 to 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized. These were not random acts. They were calculated, institutionalized procedures, often performed without the informed consent of the victims, their families, or even under duress. This report will meticulously detail the pseudo-scientific origins, the legal battles, the institutional implementation, and the profound human cost of these programs, ensuring that Anna's story and the stories of countless others are remembered. To understand how the state could systematically steal the reproductive futures of its citizens, we must first delve into the insidious ideology that provided its intellectual and moral scaffolding: the American eugenics movement. Far from being a fringe idea, eugenics was a mainstream, widely accepted science that permeated academic, medical, and political circles in the early 20th century. Eugenics, a term coined by Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, in 1883, literally means good birth. Its core premise was that human society could be improved by applying principles of selective breeding, similar to those used in agriculture or animal husbandry. Proponents believed that traits like intelligence, morality, industriousness, and even poverty or criminality were primarily inherited. Therefore, by controlling who reproduced, society could eliminate undesirable traits and foster desirable ones, leading to a healthier, more efficient, and less burdensome population. In America, this ideology gained immense traction, fueled by anxieties about immigration, industrialization, and social change. Leading universities, including Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, established eugenics courses and research centers. Prominent scientists, doctors, and social reformers championed its cause. The Carnegie Institution founded the Eugenics Record Office, ERO, at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, in 1910, which became the central hub for eugenics research and advocacy in the United States. The ERO collected vast amounts of data, often through flawed and biased methods, to prove the inheritance of undesirable traits like feeble-mindedness, pauperism, and criminality. This pseudoscience provided a convenient, scientific justification for existing social prejudices. It allowed those in power to blame poverty, crime, and social problems on the bad genes of marginalized groups, rather than on systemic inequalities or environmental factors. It offered a seemingly rational solution to complex societal issues: simply prevent the unfit from reproducing. The definition of unfit was alarmingly broad and fluid, often reflecting the prevailing prejudices of the time. The primary targets were individuals labeled as feeble-minded, a catch-all term that encompassed a wide range of intellectual disabilities, learning difficulties, and even non-conformist behaviors. However, the net quickly expanded to include the poor and dependent, individuals receiving public assistance, those in almshouses, or families deemed shiftless were often targeted, with their poverty interpreted as a sign of genetic inferiority. Racial and ethnic minorities, African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and later Hispanic populations were disproportionately subjected to sterilization. Their perceived inferiority was often linked to their race or ethnicity, cloaked in eugenic language. The mentally ill, patients in state mental hospitals were prime targets, with the belief that mental illness was hereditary and could be eliminated through sterilization. Criminals and delinquents, inmates in prisons and reformatories, particularly those convicted of sexual offenses or deemed morally degenerate, were sterilized to prevent the transmission of their criminal tendencies. The physically disabled, individuals with epilepsy, blindness, deafness, or other physical disabilities were also targeted, based on the eugenic belief that these conditions were hereditary and undesirable. Promiscuous women, young women, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or minority groups, who were deemed promiscuous or unwed mothers, were often labeled feeble-minded and sterilized to prevent them from having illegitimate children who might become a burden on the state. Anna, our protagonist, falls into this category, her simplicity and danger to herself being convenient labels for a young woman whose circumstances made her vulnerable. Propaganda played a crucial role in popularizing eugenics. Fitter families contests were held at state fairs, promoting selective breeding among desirable white, middle-class families. Educational materials, often presented in a seemingly neutral, scientific manner, warned of the menace of the feeble-minded and the burden they placed on society. This widespread public acceptance, fueled by fear and prejudice, created a social climate where forced sterilization was not only tolerated, but actively supported as a progressive solution to societal ills. The eugenics movement quickly translated its ideology into law. Indiana passed the first eugenic sterilization law in 1907. By 1931, 27 states had similar statutes. These laws typically allowed state institutions to sterilize inmates deemed hereditarily unfit without their consent or with consent obtained under duress. The legal cornerstone of America's forced sterilization programs was the infamous 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck, a young woman institutionalized at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and feeble-minded, the same institution where Anna is held, was chosen as the test case. She was labeled feeble-minded, as was her mother and her infant daughter, who was actually of normal intelligence, but born out of wedlock, a fact used to prove Carrie's promiscuity and feeble-mindedness. The Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., upheld the Virginia sterilization law. Holmes famously declared, "We have seen more than enough of the evils of the multiplication of the unfit. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This ruling provided a powerful legal precedent, legitimizing forced sterilization across the nation and encouraging other states to enact or expand their own eugenic laws. It effectively stripped individuals of their fundamental bodily autonomy, declaring that the state's perceived interest in improving the gene pool outweighed individual rights. This legal sanction, combined with the widespread scientific and public acceptance of eugenics, created an almost unstoppable force that systematically violated the lives of tens of thousands of vulnerable Americans. With legal sanction and widespread public acceptance, the forced sterilization programs became deeply embedded within America's state institutions. Mental hospitals, prisons, and colonies for the feeble-minded transformed into sites where eugenic ideology was translated into surgical reality. Anna's experience at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded was typical of thousands across the country. These institutions, often built in isolated rural areas, were designed for long-term confinement, not rehabilitation. They were overcrowded, understaffed, and often unsanitary. The daily routine was rigid, designed to control and suppress individuality. The colony was a self-contained world, governed by its own rules and insulated from external scrutiny. Doctors and administrators held immense power over the lives of their patients, often acting as judge, jury, and executioner of reproductive rights. The staff, many of whom genuinely believed in the principles of eugenics, saw themselves as performing a vital public service, protecting society from the burden of the unfit. For individuals like Anna, the path to sterilization was often paved with deception and coercion. True informed consent, as understood today, was almost non-existent. Promises of release, the most common tactic, was to link sterilization directly to release from the institution. Patients were told, explicitly or implicitly, that they would never leave unless they agreed to the minor operation. For those desperate for freedom, this was an irresistible, albeit false, promise. Anna, longing for a return to the outside world, readily agreed to Dr. Bell's proposal, believing it was her only way out. Misinformation and euphemisms, doctors and nurses often used vague or misleading language to describe the procedure. It was called a minor operation, a tubal ligation for women, a vasectomy for men, or simply a procedure to help you get better. The permanent nature of the sterilization and its impact on reproductive capacity were rarely, if ever, fully explained. Coercion of families, often poor, uneducated, or facing social stigma, were also pressured into giving consent. They might be told that sterilization was necessary for their loved one's health, or that it was the only way to prevent their child from having defective offspring. The threat of continued institutionalization, or even the loss of other children to state custody, was a powerful motivator. Anna's mother, shamed by the community and desperate for her daughter's return, was easily convinced that this was the solution. Lack of legal recourse. With Buck v. Bell as precedent, victims had virtually no legal recourse. Their pleas were dismissed, their rights ignored. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating, with legal and medical authorities working in concert to achieve eugenic goals. The sterilizations themselves were often performed in rudimentary operating rooms within the institutions. For women, a salpingectomy involved surgically cutting or tying the fallopian tubes. For men, a vasectomy involved severing the vas deferens. While these procedures were relatively simple surgically, their impact on the individual was profound and irreversible. Anna was led to a sterile, cold room. The smell of antiseptic was overpowering. The nurses, their faces impassive, prepared her. She remembered the prick of the needle, the slow descent into unconsciousness, and then waking up with a dull ache in her abdomen, a physical manifestation of the future that had just been stolen from her. The procedure was quick, efficient, and devoid of any human warmth or explanation. It was a clinical act of control, reducing a complex human being to a biological problem to be fixed. The forced sterilization programs could not have existed without the active participation of doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals. Many genuinely believed in the scientific validity of eugenics and saw themselves as pioneers in public health. They were trained in medical schools that taught eugenic principles, worked in institutions where it was standard practice, and were often lauded for their contributions to social hygiene. However, their complicity also involved a profound ethical failure. They violated the core principle of do no harm, performing irreversible procedures on individuals who could not truly consent. They prioritized a flawed scientific ideology over individual human rights, becoming instruments of state control rather than healers. The instruction manuals passed down through generations of nuns detailing exactly how to break a young woman's spirit while maintaining the appearance of Christian charity. In the Magdalene laundries find a chilling parallel here, as medical professionals developed procedures for traumatizing girls into permanent submission in the name of eugenic progress. The systematic implementation of forced sterilization programs left an indelible scar on the lives of tens of thousands of Americans. Beyond the physical act of surgery, the psychological, emotional, and social consequences were devastating, often lasting a lifetime. Anna's release from the colony, though initially a moment of triumph, quickly revealed the profound and irreversible damage inflicted upon her. She was free from the physical confines of the institution, but she carried an invisible cage within her. The minor operation had not only taken away her ability to have children, but it had also stripped her of her sense of self, her trust in authority, and her dreams for a conventional future. She found it difficult to form intimate relationships, haunted by the knowledge of what had been done to her body. The shame, instilled by the institution's narrative that she was defective and unfit, lingered like a shadow. She saw other women her age marry, build families, and experience the joys of motherhood, a future that had been cruelly denied to her. The laughter of children, once a sweet sound, became a painful reminder of her stolen choice. Anna's story is a testament to the fact that survival is not always synonymous with healing. She lived, but her life was irrevocably shaped by the state's violation, a constant reminder of the powerlessness she experienced within the walls of the colony. The psychological manipulation, the systematic demolition of personality, left her with an addiction to approval from the very system that had violated her, making true autonomy a lifelong struggle. Anna's experience was one among many, each story a unique testament to the cruelty of the system. The victims came from all walks of life, united only by their vulnerability and the state's decision that their lives were less worthy of reproductive autonomy. The feeble-minded and intellectually disabled. These were the primary targets, often institutionalized from a young age. Their sterilizations were justified as preventing the multiplication of the unfit. Many, like Carrie Buck, were not truly feeble-minded, but were labeled as such due to poverty, illiteracy, or nonconformist behavior. Their stories reveal a profound betrayal of trust by the very institutions meant to care for them. The poor and rural, poverty was often equated with genetic inferiority. Families struggling to survive were particularly vulnerable to coercion, with the promise of release or financial aid often contingent on sterilization. In rural areas, where access to legal counsel or advocacy was limited, individuals were even more susceptible to the state's unchecked power. Racial and ethnic minorities. The programs disproportionately targeted minority women, particularly African American, Native American, and Hispanic women, often under the guise of family planning or public health. In the South, Black women were often sterilized without their knowledge during childbirth or other medical procedures, a practice sometimes referred to as a Mississippi appendectomy. This revealed the intersection of eugenics with deeply ingrained racial prejudices. Promiscuous women and unwed mothers. Society's moral judgments often intersected with eugenic ideology. Young women who had children out of wedlock, or who were simply deemed morally delinquent, were often labeled feeble-minded and sterilized to prevent them from having more illegitimate children. This was a form of social control, punishing women for perceived sexual transgressions and reinforcing patriarchal norms. Prisoners and inmates. Sterilization was often used as a form of punishment or a condition for parole for individuals in prisons and reformatories, particularly those convicted of sexual crimes. The belief was that criminality was hereditary and could be cured through sterilization. These individual stories, often buried in dusty institutional records or whispered among families, reveal the profound and lasting trauma inflicted by the state. The victims suffered not only the physical violation but also deep psychological scars, shame, depression, anxiety, a loss of identity, and an inability to trust. Many lived their entire lives without understanding what had truly happened to them or why. One of the most chilling aspects of America's forced sterilization programs was the widespread silence and societal indifference that allowed them to flourish for decades. Public acceptance, fueled by eugenic propaganda and deeply ingrained prejudices. A significant portion of the public accepted these programs as a necessary and progressive measure for societal improvement. The Fitter Families contests and educational campaigns created a climate where questioning sterilization was seen as unscientific or even unpatriotic. Institutional secrecy. While the laws were public, the actual implementation often occurred behind the closed doors of state institutions. Records were often vague or deliberately misleading, obscuring the true nature of the procedures. The isolation of these facilities further ensured that abuses went largely unnoticed by the outside world. Lack of media scrutiny. For decades, mainstream media largely failed to critically examine the programs, often echoing the eugenic rhetoric of the time. When stories of abuse did emerge, they were often dismissed as isolated incidents or the complaints of unreliable individuals. Victims silencing. The victims themselves were often silenced by shame, fear, and the psychological conditioning they endured. Many were told they were defective and that the sterilization was for their own good, leading to internalized stigma that prevented them from speaking out. Those who did try to tell their stories were often dismissed as mentally unstable or unreliable. This conspiracy of silence, born of prejudice, scientific hubris, and institutional power, allowed the state to systematically violate the most intimate rights of its citizens for over 70 years. The reign of eugenic sterilization in America, while long and devastating, was not eternal. A combination of changing scientific understanding, growing public awareness, and persistent advocacy slowly chipped away at its foundations, leading to its eventual decline and, decades later, official apologies. Even at the height of the eugenics movement's popularity, dissenting voices emerged. Some religious groups, particularly the Catholic Church, opposed sterilization on moral grounds. A few legal scholars and civil liberties advocates raised concerns about individual rights and due process. However, these voices were largely drowned out by the prevailing eugenic consensus. The turning point began in the mid-20th century. The horrors of Nazi Germany's eugenics programs, which sterilized hundreds of thousands and ultimately led to the systematic murder of millions deemed unfit, cast a dark shadow over the American movement. The association with Nazi atrocities severely discredited eugenics in the public eye, forcing its proponents to rebrand or retreat. Scientific advancements also played a role. As genetic research became more sophisticated, the simplistic Mendelian inheritance models favored by early eugenicists were increasingly disproven. The idea that complex human traits like intelligence or criminality were determined by single bad genes was revealed as scientifically unsound. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought renewed attention to issues of bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, and the disproportionate impact of state policies on marginalized communities. Activists, particularly those fighting for the rights of women, people with disabilities, and racial minorities, began to expose the ongoing abuses of forced sterilization. Landmark legal cases such as Relf versus Weinberger, 1973, revealed that thousands of poor, often African American, women were being sterilized without their consent in federally funded programs. This case led to new federal regulations requiring informed consent for all sterilizations, effectively ending federal funding for coercive practices. Journalists and researchers began to uncover the vast scale of the state sterilization programs, bringing the hidden stories of victims to light. Books and articles detailed the experiences of individuals like Anna, exposing the deception, coercion, and lifelong trauma they endured. This increased public awareness finally forced states to confront their eugenic past. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, most state eugenic sterilization laws were either repealed or fell into disuse due to legal challenges and changing public opinion. North Carolina, which had one of the most active programs, continued sterilizing individuals until 1977. Oregon's law remained on the books until 1983. Decades later, a movement for official apologies and reparations began to gain momentum. In 2002, Virginia became the first state to formally apologize for its eugenics program, including the forced sterilization of thousands. Since then, North Carolina, California, Oregon, and other states have followed suit, issuing apologies and, in some cases, establishing compensation programs for surviving victims. These apologies, while long overdue, represent a crucial step in acknowledging the profound injustice inflicted by the state. They are a recognition that the scientific and moral justifications for these programs were deeply flawed, and that the bodily autonomy of every individual is a fundamental human right. The American forced sterilization programs, though officially ended, cast a long shadow over contemporary society. Their legacy continues to shape debates around reproductive rights, disability justice, medical ethics, and the enduring power of state control over individual bodies. Understanding this dark chapter is not merely an academic exercise, it is a vital warning for the present. The forced sterilization programs serve as a stark reminder of the historical struggle for reproductive justice. They highlight how the state, under the guise of public health or societal improvement, can strip individuals of their fundamental right to decide whether and when to have children. This history is crucial for understanding ongoing debates about informed consent. The programs underscore the absolute necessity of truly informed consent in all medical procedures, particularly those affecting reproductive capacity. The deceptive tactics used to sterilize Anna and thousands of others remain a cautionary tale. Coercion in healthcare, even today, subtle forms of coercion can exist within healthcare systems, particularly for vulnerable populations. The history of forced sterilization demands vigilance against any practice that pressures individuals into medical decisions against their true will. Access to reproductive healthcare, conversely, this history also informs the fight for equitable access to reproductive healthcare for all, ensuring that individuals have the agency to make choices about their bodies, free from state interference or discriminatory practices. The disproportionate targeting of individuals with disabilities in the eugenics movement has had a lasting impact on the disability rights movement. The forced sterilizations were a profound violation of the dignity and autonomy of people with disabilities, rooted in the belief that their lives were less valuable or that their existence was a burden on society. This legacy continues to inform advocacy for inclusion and self-determination. The fight for people with disabilities to live independently, make their own choices, and be fully included in society is directly linked to the historical attempts to control their reproduction and deny their humanity. Challenging stigma, the eugenic branding of certain groups as unfit or defective created deep-seated stigma that persists. Understanding this history is essential for dismantling prejudice and promoting true equity. Intersectionality, the programs reveal the intersection of various forms of oppression, disability, poverty, race, gender, demonstrating how vulnerable groups can be simultaneously targeted by multiple systems of control. The complicity of the medical profession in the forced sterilization programs represents a profound ethical failure. It serves as a chilling reminder of how science, when divorced from ethical considerations and human rights, can be weaponized for discriminatory purposes. This history demands ongoing reflection on the role of experts. It highlights the danger of unchecked authority, particularly when scientific experts are granted immense power without sufficient oversight or accountability. Bias in research. The flawed and biased research of the Eugenics Record Office underscores the importance of rigorous, ethical scientific methodology and the critical examination of underlying assumptions in research. Professional responsibility. It calls upon medical professionals to remain vigilant against ideologies that dehumanize patients or prioritize societal improvement over individual well-being and autonomy. Perhaps most disturbingly, the story of America's forced sterilization programs reveals a timeless pattern: the willingness of powerful entities to control the bodies and lives of vulnerable populations for perceived societal benefit. The same appetites that consumed Mary Catherine exist today, hidden behind professional licenses and charitable tax exemptions in the context of religious asylums. Find a direct parallel here in the medical and state apparatus. Unchecked power. The programs demonstrate what happens when state power operates without sufficient checks and balances, particularly when targeting those with limited voice or legal recourse. Normalization of abomination. The widespread public acceptance of eugenics shows how easily societies can normalize practices that, in retrospect, are profoundly immoral. This serves as a warning against complacency and the dangers of allowing prejudice to masquerade as science or progress. Historical amnesia. The deliberate efforts to erase or downplay this history underscore the importance of remembering uncomfortable truths. Someone refused to let these atrocities disappear into convenient historical amnesia. Only by confronting our past can we prevent its repetition. Anna and the tens of thousands like her were not statistics in dusty government ledgers. They were human beings with dreams, hopes, and the fundamental right to bodily autonomy. Their stories, once silenced, now serve as a powerful testament to the enduring struggle for justice, and a stark warning against the dangers of allowing the state to steal our bodies, our choices, and our futures. The American forced sterilization programs represent one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history, a chilling testament to the devastating consequences of pseudoscience, unchecked state power, and societal prejudice. The systematic violation of bodily autonomy, often cloaked in the language of progress and public health, left tens of thousands of lives shattered and futures irrevocably stolen. The cold clinical efficiency with which these procedures were carried out, the deception employed to secure consent, and the widespread complicity of medical professionals and the public reveal a profound moral failing at the heart of a nation that prided itself on freedom and individual rights. The Supreme Court's sanction in Buck v. Bell provided a legal shield for these atrocities, cementing a legacy of injustice that continues to resonate today. While the official programs have ended and states have begun to issue long overdue apologies, the underlying dynamics that enabled their horrors persist. The debates around reproductive rights, disability justice, and the ethical responsibilities of science are directly informed by this history. The vulnerability of marginalized populations to state control, the insidious nature of systemic discrimination, and the ease with which societies can normalize abhorrent practices remain urgent concerns. We remember Anna not as a feeble-minded patient, but as a young woman whose dreams were stolen by a system that deemed her unfit. Her story, and the stories of countless others, demand that we remain eternally vigilant against any ideology or policy that seeks to control human reproduction, to define human worth based on perceived utility, or to violate the fundamental right to bodily autonomy. The scars of the past serve as a permanent reminder that true progress is measured not by scientific advancement alone, but by the unwavering commitment to human dignity and justice for all. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. And there are so many more stories waiting to be told.